Welcome to the Duckpin Podcast with your host, Brian Griffiths. And now, here's Brian.
Next week, the Maryland General Assembly will meet for another legislative session. It'll be the first session that they are returning to after in the wake of everything that we have seen over the course of the last year with the COVID-19 virus. Joining me on this week's episode of the Duckpin Podcast, my longtime friend, the House Minority Leader of the Maryland General Assembly, Delegate Nic Kipke. Nic, thanks for joining us on this week's show.
Great to be here. Happy New Year to everyone.
Yeah, Happy New Year to you and the family as well. Speaking of COVID, it's well documented that you are you guys had the COVID virus back a couple of months ago. Tell us a little bit about how you're feeling and kind of what any after effects you guys might have had from having the virus.
Fortunately, we have all my aunts. I have two aunts, a cousin. Me and my wife, Susanna, we all caught COVID from my grandfather, who caught it while he was in the hospital. And all of us, fortunately, have recovered well. My grandfather, he didn't, but he's sort of one of those people that you hear people say they died with COVID. COVID really took the last bit that he had left in him, and he passed. But for all of us, we've recovered really well. It was a serious illness for most of us. A couple family members, it was very minor. The rest of us, it was a real, it was like a serious cold. There was only one day for me where I thought, if this gets any worse, I might have to go to the hospital. And that was a day when, I was walking to get my mail from the mailbox, and walking back up to the house, I just couldn't breathe. So I had to stop and wait there a little while, and never really had anything like that happen to me before. But fortunately, we've really not had any of those after effects that you hear about that can linger for people. I do notice after I had it, and still, if I'm at a rested state, or if I'm driving down the road and not really exerting myself, I'll notice that it feels a little bit more like more labor to breathe. It's just a very minor thing, and it could truly just be in my head. But that's the only thing I've noticed. All of us, you can run, you can work out, and you don't have any problems at all. So we're all very lucky, and in some ways feeling quite a bit of relief that, we have some immunity. We know that how our bodies would react to it. And there's, I think, a weight off of everybody's shoulders in that way, because truly, I know plenty of people who have been in the ICU, they've been on ventilator. I know people, even recently, of all ages, frankly, that this was very serious and life-threatening.
Let's talk about COVID as it relates to the upcoming General Assembly session. Let's just talk about logistically for a second. We've seen what the Senate is doing, where they're having their plexiglass pods around the desks. The House of Delegates is doing something a little differently, using kind of splitting up the chambers into those who will meet in the House of Delegates chamber and those who are going to meet over in one of the office buildings. Can you kind of explain to people kind of what that's going to look like, and how, from your perspective, that's going to impact legislating during this year's session?
Well, the good news for people that are center right, I think that, fewer things are going to get done during the legislative session, just by the nature of the fact that at least, the month of January, there will be committee work. There will be bills that have been introduced and bills that were heard last session that are pretty well worked out, that are going to be addressed. But the House is going to adjourn basically until early February from voting on issues on the floor. And, and all of the chairmen, the speaker, they've all been really aggressive, saying, only things that really need to get done that aren't very controversial is what the focus should be on. The committee that I'm on, there was a bill last year that, I was really heavily involved in, and a local family from Pasadena was involved in, where pharmacists can administer drug treatments like Vivitrol that doctors prescribe. There's a huge problem where getting access to that, there's roadblocks. And so we're trying to fix that, get rid of the bureaucracy. It didn't pass in the last hours of session, but it's one of the things we're going to get done early in session.
Talk about the, we've seen the COVID response. I know that there have been lots of opinions from lots of people on both sides of the aisle about how the way the state has handled it, about the shutdowns of commerce, about the shutdowns of school. From your perspective as a legislator, somebody who does have oversight as a legislator of state government and its operations, what do you see as the strengths and weaknesses so far of the state's response to COVID?
Well, it's a really big question. One thing that I'm firmly, in the beginning, I don't think, I think most people were willing to say, well, if this is real, we better, deal with it. And it is real. And we've learned a lot, in the beginning when they were saying that people were going to, suffocate to death because there weren't enough ventilators. I think reasonable people can say, we better figure out what we need to do here to get more ventilators. But at this point, understanding what's going on in our hospitals, and God bless all the hospital workers, they've had a lot to put up with over the last year. But our numbers are pretty reasonable. They're pretty manageable. There's a lot of people in our hospitals, but it's not at a level that isn't manageable. And people are, I heard the other day that the survival rate for people who get this in a serious way is 100 times better than what it was in March. So they've figured out how to deal with it. And certainly any loss of life is tragic, and we need to do everything that we can to prevent it. But we also have to understand that all of this needs to be dealt with in a balanced way. If we were to decide that, we're not going to allow people to get sick or hurt or harmed, we wouldn't let people drive a car, we wouldn't let people eat donuts. I mean, we've got to be reasonable about this. And, the tragedy for youth that are being isolated and not able to be in an educational setting in Maryland, I think is tragic. Places like New York City have figured out that young people, even though they do catch it, they really don't transmit it. And it's very unlikely that they actually have symptoms. I mean, you do hear of like a story here and there that's very, very extremely rare, but you just can't trace teachers catching COVID from kids. And that's a worldwide thing, but I'm very disappointed that we haven't begun to reopen education in Maryland. And then, this idea that we can just stifle commerce with no end in sight, in my mind, is totally irresponsible. It's really immoral. And I think the folks that fought off what happened in Anne Arundel County recently, they were able to scientifically demonstrate that, forcing restaurants to completely close to indoor and outdoor dining does nothing really measurably to prevent the spread of COVID. People don't like to hear it, but I know this from my own personal experience. People are largely catching COVID from their loved ones or friends where they let their guard down. With my grandfather, my aunts and I, and, we had masks on when we went to help him out of the hospital. We didn't put a mask on him. He was so frail, and, I don't know if we wouldn't have caught it, but certainly, you let your guard down around loved ones. You see your grandmother, you want to hug her, that's just, that's human nature. So that's where people are catching and spreading. And we're going to see a surge now because of Christmas and New Year's. And so, that's a long way of answering it, but the gist of it is it needs to be balanced. And I think from a legislative perspective, some things do need to change as it relates to our emergency powers that are granted during a state of emergency. Delegating has taken place throughout the state, from in a limited way might make sense, but giving full authority to some local health officer is, in my opinion, not the right approach.
Yeah, I think the Anne Arundel County cases we've demonstrated is a lot different than in a lot of other cases because of the fact that the plaintiffs in this case were able to scientifically prove that the health officer was not working in with scientific data when making his recommendations to the county executive. Now, those two issues, public school and the economy being shut down, kind of merge together when we talk about one of the first issues that the General Assembly is going to come across during the session, which is an override of Governor Hogan's veto of the Kirwan Commission recommendations. For those of you who don't know, the General Assembly is required as part of their opening orders of business to address issues of vetoes by the governor. And one of those, the most prominent of those, is the Kirwan Commission recommendations. And of course, last year, most Republicans, can't say all, unfortunately, most Republicans did vote against the Kirwan Commission recommendation plan, which at the time we knew was going to be very expensive and very ineffective. with the economy, of course, being shut down and everybody's income and sales tax revenue being affected, that economic impact goes from bad to worse. Do you think that the Democrats in the General Assembly have any buyer's remorse about voting for this? Do you think there's any chance that seeing what we have seen, the economic impact of the pandemic, that the legislators will vote to sustain Governor Hogan's veto?
So in a rational world, I think you would. But yeah, I noticed that you had an op-ed in the Capitol recently talking about a taxpayer bill of rights, or, what these folks, I think what they find comfort in is they can pass anything under the sun, just like O'Malley did, and promise the world to everybody. But each year they can just cut it. I mean, O'Malley cut education deeply. People don't talk about that. But what those cuts were sort of, I don't know, sci-fi spending formulas that, everything's always going to be wonderful and money is just always going to roll in. And of course, he did raise taxes unfortunately, I believe the Dems will override the governor's veto. But I'm sure they're going to pass some, they call it Kirwan 2.0. There's going to be another bill. There has to be another bill to modify what they passed. And really this, that's all about money, I think. The sad thing is Kirwan could have been the opportunity of a generation to reform public schools. And I truly believe, will continue to fail children in poverty. Those kids that have been in schools that have failed them for generations are going to be failing them for more generations, because it's not focused enough on the kid. It's too much focused on, the bureaucracy of the system. And unfortunately, there's no real kind of, there's nothing that shakes that up. We did offer alternatives. They look at school systems around the world that were doing a great job with outcomes. One was in Europe, and they tout it. And the thing that they tout about it is certain things that I don't necessarily object to. They spend more money there. However, the money follows the kid. The kid in that country can go to any school in the entire country as long as they have seats for the student to go there. And if you had that type of competition where the money follows the student, I think you could see some really revolutionary things. I mean, competition's really good, and it will weed out some bad schools, some bad teachers. And, if you're in charge of a system and you've got a teacher that's constantly getting bad grades from the students, I think you'd get some change there. And it also obviously gives students that are in perpetually failing schools the ability to get out of there and to go to a place where they might have more opportunity. So my prediction is they'll, I hope, delay the override until, maybe we have a little bit more time to flesh it out and potentially just have one new, I don't want to call it a Kirwan bill, maybe some new educational reform measure. But, unfortunately, though, I think that they are focused like a laser on overriding the governor's veto and passing something that tinkers around with Kirwan.
And probably the same thing as well with the other tax bills the governor vetoed last year as well. Never mind the economic impact that those bills would have. I think that the Democrats, I don't think realize that the case can be pressed against them, particularly as it comes out of the pandemic, when everybody was using Netflix and Amazon and ordering everything's online. We start talking about digital sales and taxing those and digital advertising and stuff like that. But we know the Democrats will pass it anyway.
Yeah, one of the bills that relates to internet ads, taxing basically internet ads that pop up through Google search or whatever, that's all going to be passed on to mom and pop restaurants. I mean, the people that are going to have to pay more for their ads to survive are a lot of the people who are barely surviving. Nevertheless, that whole thing was so, the scheme is so poorly rigged that even the Department of Legislative Services is not including it in their budget numbers, their projections. They're including this tax increase on tobacco, but they're not including that one because they think that it's unconstitutional. It'll be challenged in the courts and very likely to be thrown out.
Let's talk a little bit more about budgetary issues. And one of my pet peeves that I always rail about is the structural deficit and how mandated spending will mandated spending impacts the ability for the state to meet its fiscal requirements and kind of forces us into a position where tax hikes are always on the board. Mm-hmm. When you combine the Democrats' appetite for mandated spending with the new constitutional amendment that unfortunately passed this year, which gives the General Assembly more leeway into spending the state's budget, how bad do you think that how are these two issues going to come together? The General Assembly has always wanted additional budgetary authority. How is that going to mesh with the Democrats' insistence on mandated spending? And do you think we're ever going to reach a point, now being probably a better time than any, where Democrats start to realize that mandated spending is the enemy and not the friend of the budgetary process?
Yeah, one of the biggest problems with mandated spending is it's a fixed thing. It's fixed. So you have these formulas that are fixed in the budget, and they're not nimble. You're not creating a nimble budget for modern times. And some of our formulas go back to the 1980s. So I just don't understand why anybody thinks the reason they create these formulas is a way to sort of buy off certain groups. Look, we can't give you what you want, but we're going to create this formula. We're going to give you an extra 4% every year, starting 2 years from now, going out forever in the future. It's promises in the future. And, the folks that are actually responsible for balancing the budget, they say to themselves in the back of their mind, well, if I don't have the money, we'll just change the law that year and not fund those folks. And it happens all the time. It's happened with Governor Hogan in office. It's happened with Martin O'Malley in office. The bottom line is how much money comes in versus your obligations. And, you've got to live within those obligations. And obviously, being one of the highest tax states in the nation, we should, do a better job than what we do with all of this. But unfortunately, and that's part of my objection to the legislature having more control. I think it's easier for a governor to have, mom or dad in that office creating the budget, and mom and dad can tell an interest group, look, we just don't have the money this year. I'll try my best next year. When you give it to the legislature, there's sort of a pressure cooker effect that takes place there that I think is harder for legislators to say no. I think it's harder for legislators to be mom and dad and say, look, we just can't afford it this year. And the other fear I have about this constitutional amendment that, let's also be honest, the legislators who passed this thing lied to the voters by saying, kind of misleading the voters that there was some type of constitutional amendment for a balanced budget. I mean, that's what I had voters coming up to me and telling me they voted for the question to have a balanced budget constitutional amendment, so that they certainly lied to voters about what that bill did. But one of the big problems I have with it, and it's really a great fear, when O'Malley was governor, there was a real harm done to rural parts of the state that aren't blue politically. And important things just were never funded. They never got their fair share of very critical things. And, at least when you have a R in the governor's office or a caring, more centric Democrat, you think that they will care more about those places than the folks that are running the show who are from the central part of the state. And I really fear that this will siphon even more dollars in the future away from some of the Republican counties.
Let's talk a little bit. We've talked about budget issues. We've talked about education. We've talked about COVID. What are some other issues that you think that will be hot for the General Assembly this year? And in addition to those issues, what are some of your priorities that you look forward to addressing this year?
So in the House, we have created a series of work groups to address and talk about and think tank and bring in experts to look at, what are critical things that we should be focused on this session. For example, I think everybody wants to figure out ways to, help small privately owned businesses stay in business, try to, provide them with some flexibility or relief, whatever. And, but, it's not really a good idea for politicians, I think, to come up with a lot of these ideas. So we've had really astute people from industry and from different groups come in to talk to us about what we should be doing. For example, think about like a bowling alley. They were forced to be closed. They're not allowed to stay open past 10 p.m. I imagine people that play bowl, a lot of them like to drink beer past 10 p.m. The bowling alley can't sell them the beer. I mean, so you have basically, and bowling alleys are enormous places. Their property taxes are like $25,000 a year per location. And I don't know if people know this. People probably think they're owned by some big chain. Most of them, I think all of them in Anne Arundel County, are owned by local families. Well, they've been forced to be closed, and they have property taxes due and other taxes due. So there's been a lot of discussion around, we can't just like sort of forgive people's taxes. That is economically not feasible, but maybe provide some type of delayed or payment plans or over a series of 5 years or something like that. So those are some of the ideas that we're working through and we're talking to the right people about. So I think that's a major focus. I think we also have to revisit crime. I mean, beyond the whole economic devastation that people are facing, businesses are facing, and the future really looks uncertain for a lot of folks financially. The crime, not just in Baltimore City, but certainly there, is a real concern. I had emails today from a lady whose son goes to College Park, and he's living on campus, even though they're not in classes. And she had all these stories about this rampant crime in and around College Park. We had problems here in my town in Pasadena, a few incidences that I don't think you would have seen a few years ago. So I think we need to make sure that, we as the Republican Party are being the voice for, some type of solutions. We've offered different solutions. The governor's offered some solutions, but I don't think things are getting any better. Baltimore City has had over 300 murders every year for at least the last 4 years. It's harming the city's ability to turn around. People aren't going to the city to go to Little Italy or to go to a museum. People are avoiding Ravens games in normal times. So crime is a big problem as well. And truly, I think it's aside from the pandemic, I think crime is really a major problem for the state.
One of the unique things about this upcoming General Assembly session is the fact that you, as a delegate from District 31, one of my delegates, your counterpart in the Senate, my senator, your senator, District 31, Senator Bryan Simonaire, taking over as the Senate Minority Leader for the first time. How interesting do you think that makes that dynamic, having both party leaders from the same district? And how much of a challenge is it to make sure that when you guys are working together, that you get the full perspective from the disparate geographic regions of the caucus?
Well, one of the things that Bryan did, and I never suspected Bryan would be in leadership, not because he's not smart or he's never been that type of character. I never saw that coming for him. But I have to tell you, since he's done it, and I was surprised that he was even considering it, he's done what I think is one of the most important things, and he's done a statewide tour. He's met with local folks. He was in the Eastern Shore meeting with farmers. He's been to manufacturing. Kathy Shalagan and I did that when we first got elected, and we have relationships with folks, and people call us and say, "Hey, this bill that's coming through is really important or really dangerous. Let me tell you why." And I think that's a really important thing to do. And the fact that he did that very early on told me that he's got some good instincts about that. You really do have it, and that's trouble with Annapolis. The legislators from the center of the state need to really be in touch with the state as a whole. I mean, the state as if we don't look out for Garrett County and Allegheny County, we're going to end up with a higher unemployment in those counties that will affect our budget. So the state is truly intertwined, and the health of the entire state is extremely important. And so unfortunately, because in those regions of the state, there's few or no Democrats elected, well, actually, I like that. I just wish there was more of that. But my point is that there's not enough influence from the Democrats in leadership. So people like me and Bryan, we have to go to the speaker or to the chairman. And sometimes we'll take a legislator from that area with us. and really explain and implore upon them what the importance is. And honestly, many times we're successful with that. I mean, I think it shows that, there's a unified effort to change something. And so Brian doing that, I think is extremely important. And so, and I'm, obviously I'm going to do everything I can to help him and Michael Huff be successful. And, it is interesting to change your horse in the middle of a pandemic, but we'll all be working together to help each other out.
On a similar topic, when you came in to the General Assembly in 2007, Speaker Michael Bush, Senate President Mike Miller had been there for a while in their seats and running their chambers, of course. Speaker Bush tragically passed away 2 years ago. Senate President Miller stepped down and from both his presidency and now his Senate as he continues to fight cancer. What do you think has been the biggest change with that leadership going? And obviously, you have a certain perspective being a delegate and having worked with Speaker Bush and now Speaker Jones. What do you think has been the biggest change in that transition from your time when you were a freshman 14 years ago to now?
I think it's really the unknown. There was such a historical and sort of built up expectation of what Mike Miller and Mike Bush thought and how they behaved and what their instincts were and all of that it was a lot easier to sort of predict how things would go. And Bill Ferguson and Adrian Jones are less predictable. And obviously the Republicans helped Adrian Jones be the speaker. A big reason for that is because she's worked very well with the minority party over the years. She was the capital budget chairwoman, and she did a lot to help those rural counties out that I was talking about. And she seems to have respect for us as well, which is really important. And there aren't, especially in modern politics, there's a lot of legislators on the left that don't have respect for people who don't agree with them. We talked earlier, we go to the same church, and our pastor recently implored people in the sermon. He was talking about how it used to be that people would hate someone else's politics, but now they sort of hate someone else just because of their politics. And that shift in our culture is really sad. I mean, really sad. And so, I think in the Senate president and with the speaker, these are two people who they have the respect of the minority party. We don't agree on many things, and that's natural because of politics, but they've treated us well in their roles prior to being speaker and president. And I think that's really important, but it is a very different place. I'm so grateful that I've started calling them leftist regressives. This new breed of Democrat, they're very scary. This new breed of Democrat that believes that screaming down someone that doesn't agree with you is in any way appropriate or productive or American. It's a totally un-American way to be, and it's very sad, and it's flowed beyond politics into everyday life. There's always been those awkward conversations at the Thanksgiving dinner with a more conservative and a more liberal member of the family that likes to talk about politics. But it's gotten so much worse, and I think all of us need to reject it and speak out against it wherever we can.
One of the reasons why Annapolis is a little more combative these days is because of gerrymandering, and we are getting ready to go into another redistricting period. This will be the first time in, I don't even remember, probably 1950, I think it was, that the last time a Republican controlled the redistricting process, and the first time that we've had redistricting go, happen with a Republican governor. Given the way it happened, it occurs now. The redistricting process occurs now in the Constitution. So we know Governor Hogan is committed to redistricting reform. The General Assembly will still have to adopt congressional districts, and will still have an opportunity to adopt legislative districts as well. Even though that opportunity is curtailed by the Constitution. What do you think those districts ultimately look like? Do you think that the districts that Governor Hogan presents to the General Assembly will provide for more equitable districts or an opportunity for increased Republican participation? And do you think that single member districts are going to be part of the equation?
So the governor has committed to me, and I feel very confident that we're going to see it for House of Delegates districts, single member districts produced. I think you're going to see diverse districts that are built around, a community instead of built around what which political leaders want certain people to get elected. And that's going to produce diverse districts. I think you'll see political diversity expand in Maryland, which means more Republicans in the General Assembly. We'll certainly have more Republicans in Congress. And you're right, the legislature does have the ability to tinker around with the maps that are produced. But I think it's a dangerous thing for them to do for a couple of reasons. The main reason is Hogan has advocated, and the Republicans have co-sponsored, even a few brave Democrats have co-sponsored the governor's redistricting reform legislation. He's going to use that legislation as a model. It has not passed, but he's going to use it as a model to create a commission an independent commission outside of the legislative process that will, create the maps for the General Assembly. And he's going to give, as the bill did, clear guidelines that communities should be kept intact. We shouldn't have, splattered districts all over the state. That is just totally wrong and immoral. After the legislature, so I think that's very popular. There are groups like Common Cause Maryland, NAACP, the ACLU, the League of Women Voters, all of these groups. This is one of their top priorities to push in Maryland, and they came in and testified for the governor's bill. I think the governor's also going to, has a big way of communicating, and people listen and throughout the state. And I believe he's going to use his position to communicate. He's still very popular in many places in Maryland, and he's going to communicate that this is a fair thing. And if the Democrats really get ugly about it, I think it's dangerous for them politically. But if they do, the good news is, as has been done in the past successfully, we are prepared to go to the court and have the court undo any nasty gerrymandering the legislature might try to do. So in the end, I think they'll lose. So if the governor produces truly fair maps, which he will through this process, I think it's very dangerous politically for the General Assembly to mess that up. I think it's dangerous for them politically. So I'm optimistic. There's a lot of reasons to be pessimistic about politics right now. It's very ugly. You almost don't want to look. It's terrible. But this is one area that in Maryland we should feel like there is a brighter future for us. There's a lot of opportunity for Republicans to gain seats in the legislature and in Congress, and it's one bright spot for our future.
Talking about gaining seats, one of your duties as as the minority leader is also in electing more Republicans to the General Assembly. And, usually at this time in the process, you already know you're recruiting candidates. I know there are people who are already running and candidates who are being recruited, but that becomes a little more challenging when you don't know what the districts are like. So, how much of a challenge is that to you, and kind of how do you avoid kind of backing yourself into a corner where you have too many candidates in one district and not enough candidates in another district? I mean, it seems like it's a big challenge in a normal year for a minority leader, and one that might be a little more so right now.
It is very difficult, especially with the concept of having single member districts. There'll be incumbents that do a great job that are in the same district currently, where you could have 2 or 3 elected in the same district, where they'll be in the same district. And so one of them has to retire, move, or run against somebody else that's doing a good job. So it's very challenging from that perspective. And it's challenging from a recruitment perspective. Pitching to someone that's talented and would do a great job in the legislature, hey, we'd like to see you consider running. And then they ask you the question, where would I be running? And what does that look like? And you tell them, well, it's kind of up in the air. It definitely makes it harder. And it is a real challenge. We're handicapped by the fact that the census data won't be available, we think, until late spring. The governor is really going to have to jump on that for congressional districts. There's a little bit, because of federal deadlines, there's more flexibility for the General Assembly maps, but still there is the potential that we won't have a good knowledge of what those districts are going to look like until the year you're running in them. We're hopeful that that can be done sooner. It's out of our control. The Governor's Commission is who's going to control all of that, but we're certainly advocating. We'd like to see those maps in a special session in 2021 as soon as possible for both congressional districts and the General Assembly.
One last question before I get you out of here, and that's kind of, you mentioned it previously, talking about kind of just the state of where politics are right now. We've seen, numbers in Maryland, particularly favorability numbers for President Trump, particularly, have not been very good. And I think that's bled down to the state and local level and affecting turnout and electoral votes in those races. How do you think that President Trump leaving the stage, at least public office here in the next couple of weeks, how do you think that's going to affect turnout, particularly for House of Delegates races in the next year's election?
Yeah, I don't know. What's interesting is we've seemed to have lost voters who punished us, who previously voted for us. So in suburban areas of Maryland, Republicans traditionally have done very well, but didn't last election. And those voters, although those voters did vote for Governor Hogan, they definitely voted against probably all other Republicans on their ballot. And so some people talk about that like a permanent shift among the electorate, and time will only tell. We have done better in non-traditional areas in Maryland and around the country among Hispanic voters, Asian American voters, Black voters have, the shift in the numbers among Black voters and Hispanic voters, it is pretty dramatic, and I think we really have a great opportunity to continue to grow, in those communities. What we represent, our ideals that we believe in, I think are very popular in those communities. And frankly, I think especially in recent times, it's become, in my opinion, more like a shift politically. It's almost like the working people are now leaning more Republican, and sort of the college educated, not that they don't work, obviously, but the college educated folks that might enjoy a lot of trips to a country club, they seem to have gone more Democratic. And so there's a real shift, and I think it has a lot to do with economics and what the day-to-day challenges you face. I think if you face day-to-day challenges where you're not really necessarily happy with your kids' public schools anymore, if your job security doesn't feel great, but you're a hard worker, those are people that I think don't feel like the Democrats are caring about them like they used to. And we certainly do. We always have, obviously. And we just, I think, need to do a better job in Maryland, reaching into those communities, recruiting candidates from those communities that are competent and caring. And I think that's a recipe for success for our future. But truly, the best thing that's going to deshackle Republicans, is removing the shackles of gerrymandering. We 2 cycles ago, we picked up a lot of seats in the House of Delegates. It was a historic record. And if we had had fair districts in that election, I don't want to commit to the fact that we would have been in the majority, but we would have picked up probably double what we picked up. And that really changes the political dynamic in Annapolis. And so there's hope for the future, and we're going to keep working on it.
If folks want to reach out to you for more information, think that they should be one of the candidates running for the House of Delegates next year, how can they reach out?
So the email is kipke@kipke.com, spelled Kipke @kipke.com. Of course, I'm on, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, which is also another source of contention for modern politics, I have to admit as well. I try to show as many cute pictures of my kids to lighten up the mood, but of course, occasionally I have to put out there things, stand up against things that I think are wrong as well. So, But look, I think a lot of Republicans are feeling very desperate right now. A lot of Republicans like a lot about what the president has tried to do as president, whether it's border security, rule of law, standing up for our Constitution. There's a lot that, some of the Middle East peace agreements. I mean, there's some really good stuff. And of course, the president did occasionally get in his own way, and it certainly harmed him politically in this election. But then there's also a lot of concern about security in the election. So, I mean, this is a tough time for everybody. And so if I can just give you one, thing to be hopeful about, it's this redistricting thing in Maryland. And, we're going to have a lot of opportunity in the House and the Senate. And I do really mean, if you care and you're a hard worker, we need caring, competent candidates for the next election.
Delegate Nic Kipke, the House Minority Leader, my delegate, somebody I've known for a quarter century because we're getting old. Thanks for joining me tonight, Nic.
Good to be with you. God bless you all. God bless the Constitution. God bless the state of Maryland.
Amen.
Happy New Year.
This has been the Duckpin Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and download.